4 hours, get some coffee out. Let's just do it. All right, guys. Today we're going to talk about two things. Well, one thing really is floodplains. And within floodplains, we're going to talk about how we manage floodplains and fluvial hazards. And that refers to the hazards in floodplains. Fluvial refers to rivers specifically. So first we'll explore different definitions of floodplains and flooding and hazards in river corridors. We'll talk about how floodplain management happens in the US. And we'll discuss options for managing the floodplains in this kind of increasingly variable climate. Our exposure to flood hazards is increasing as we urbanize more, that sort of thing. How can we deal with that? There are many definitions, and then last thing I'll say is this is not going to be on this coming exam. This will be on the next exam. But there will be homework assignments associated with all this stuff after the exam. I'll move my little window real quick. Great. So floodplain has many definitions. They can be regulatory definition. And in this case, we've got a floodplain. It's defined as the 1% AEP floodplain, meaning we've done that statistical analysis on a stream gauge. We figured out what that discharge is associated with that AEP. And then we've done a hydraulic model, which we'll talk about for our next lecture, to model where that water goes, given that discharge and given the topography of the floodplain. So that's kind of a regulatory definition. It's like an engineering definition. And then within that, you've got the floodway and then this flood fringe. The floodway is the area that you kind of think of as the core flow of water, but it's also regulatorily defined as you can't do development within the floodway that would increase the elevation of the flood by 1 foot. So that's this kind of regulatory. It's a weird definition. It's kind of actually hard to model that, but the floodway is kind of like a special zone that you don't want to mess with as much. So here's what that floodway definition is. You can encroach in the floodplain only so much that the floodway. Okay, sorry. Let me back up here. The floodway is, in fact, the area that you would have to encroach to raise the water level 1 foot. That's how they define the floodway. So it's this kind of made up thing. So to model it, you would have to put obstructions in and kind of push them in until you get a 1 foot elevation. That's a floodway, yeah. And the idea of the floodway again is it's like the core flow of water, and it has special regulations. So maybe you can build in the flood fringe, but not the floodway. I don't know exactly the specifics there. So really the floodway is defined by a hydraulic model, and it has kind of elevated regulations versus the flood fringe, where some sort of development is allowed to occur. Obviously, it's discouraged. You need insurance, etc. So that's kind of like this regulatory hydraulic definition. We also have a fluvial geomorphic definition. Does anyone know that term? Fluvial geomorphology. So we talked about fluvial, which means river, right? Fluvial. Geomorphic, so geo is land or rock or the earth, and then morphology is the shape. So we're talking about the shape of the river is really what this is, or the form of the river, fluvial geomorphology. And really what it refers to is how that changes over time, because rivers are dynamic. This is a relative elevation model. They've taken a digital elevation model and then detrended it, so that's basically flat. And then every pixel in this is so many feet above the bottom of the channel. And what it's showing is, this is a Quinault River in Washington State. It's showing how this river has moved across the landscape over time. It's kind of ghostly, right? or maybe it's a tape line. I don't know. I'm gonna go with a more beautiful interpretation. So rivers are dynamic. The Colorado River in town is dynamic, or at least it used to be dynamic until we put lots of dikes and gravel ponds and stuff on it. But there's potential hazards associated with this, right? If we put a building in right here and we see the river's been moving in this direction, well, our building could be in harm's way. And so we manage at a national level for these hydrologic and hydraulic hazards. We typically don't manage for these fluvial geomorphic hazards or account for them often. So let's think about what a floodplain actually is. It's a land feature, right? And it's made up of a lot of different things. We've got the river channel, but we also have these kind of signatures that the river has imparted on the landscape. And so these side channels, maybe you see meander scars like in that other image, oxbow lakes, other types of streams and side channels. So the river is more than just the channel. The river corridor is all connected either through water, right, from side channels, or kind of over time as the channel migrates across this floodplain. This is the South St. Vrain River before the 2013 flood. This is just outside of Lyons. And here's the South St. Vrain River after the 2013 flood. Just kind of go back and forth. This creek, it's a creek. It's pretty quiescent normally, and if you remember that graphic I showed you of flood magnitudes, when I talked about the mixed populations, you had that kind of band of floods every year that occurred that was kind of pretty tight, and every now and then you got these little pops. Well, that's this creek right here. And people build their homes right up next to it. They've got their nice little favorite fishing spot. And it's a pretty chill little stream until it's not. And when it's not, it's a raging torrent of sediment and water. It moved, hundreds of feet to the other side of the valley in this particular location.
Highway 36.
I can't remember. So this is the one that goes not to Estes Park. The Estes Park Road goes up here. So this is the other one that goes up to like Ward and I don't know. I always forget how those two things connect.
Like Meader.
Oh no, that's Boulder. Yeah, is that coming out of Boulder? Is that Route 36? I don't remember now. Yeah. So Lyons has two creeks, South and North St. Vrain, and this is the southern route, which. Again, I think it just goes up to that peak-to-peak highway, the little tiny towns up there. It's also just downstream of the canyon mouth. That's why this was particularly dynamic, because all the debris flows and stuff that happened in the canyons just came out and deposited here on these little homes. This home was covered, not covered, but the first floor was covered with feet of sediment.
So when something like that happens, did they go in there and like rechannelize that stream? Or is it pretty much just let it go where it's going to naturally go?
Yeah, in some cases they did. In some cases they did put it back to where it was. It's just going to be another few decades before it finds its new path again. So we can kind of pretend that it's going to be a nice, pleasant river, right, and just put it back, or we can kind of work with what happened. In this case, they did, quote unquote, restore it. And kind of put it back into a channel, but I think a lot of this land was bought out to be open space because it's so hazardous. And so that even though it's kind of back in a single channel, it will have the opportunity to move around and not take someone's house out.
We're like when flooding, I guess there kind of is a good indication on, water's going to take the path of least resistance, right? So if it rechannelizes somewhere, that's maybe where it should be anyways, right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, the thing is though that rivers are dynamic. So this route is the result of all of what you just said, right? Maybe this was a really long path and it found just kind of a straight path down the valley, right? But this is going to change over time. And so you have this big kind of disturbance, and then the river is going to kind of selectively take the fine sediment away, and then it's going to start to shrink down, right, over time. So what people will do often is try to predict what that stable form is, and then put it back to where it's going to be, and jump ahead 10 years or 20 years. Yeah, you want to work with the river. You don't want to work against the river as much as you can. Doesn't always work out that way, but yeah.
So all that happened because the houses were built?
No, not because of the houses. The houses were there.
So they were there, right? And then-
Yeah, the houses didn't trigger this. It was all the sediment and water coming down from the foothills. They just happened to be in the line of fire, basically.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Was this a lot of work for,
Julie, yeah, Julie worked on. I actually get to work with her on a project related to this post-flood thing. Yeah. So they did some of the restoration design for lions and some of the modeling to figure out which reaches are more stable and less stable. That sort of thing. So what are flood hazards? There's a lot of different kinds. We kind of think of floods as like getting wet, right? Water going to where we don't expect it, or maybe we do expect it and we just don't like it there. And so kind of the basic thing that we think about is what I'm going to call fluvial inundation. Fluvial, again, is river. Inundation is getting wet, things that are becoming wet. So here's the Arkansas River. It's a really low gradient river. It's a tributary to the Mississippi. It flooded in Oklahoma, and the river came up, the water went out, and homes got wet. I mean, they got wet, and a lot of these probably had to be rebuilt. Right? So this is disastrous. It's not the river moving though, necessarily. I mean, the river's probably moving a little bit. We can also have flooding on fans, and Colorado has a lot of fans. If you live in Eagle, you're very familiar with fans that kind of come right out down to the highway. Same with Glenwood Springs. There's a big fan complex on the southern side that they've tried to mitigate this kind of flooding from. This is the San Luis Valley coming off the Sangre de Cristos. And so these fans are just basically, as you can see, like erosion happened, right, over millennia and millions of years, and deposit the sediment at the toe of the valley. So it didn't really move very far, but the sediment's kind of spreading out in the fan. And so if we get a flood here, that water has a lot of different paths to go. It's convex. And so instead of being in a valley bottom, kind of funneled in one direction, the water can kind of run off and go many ways. And so building on fans can be particularly hazardous if you happen to be in an area where that could get wet. So there's a whole special kind of alluvial fan floodplain management. Boulder is built on a lot of fans coming out of the foothills. There's 2 Mile Canyon Creek, and this is in North Boulder. So you can see the topography here. Here's a hogback, another hogback. A creek comes through, and then this is the fan right here. So this is the kind of weird convex topography. They modeled this using a 2-dimensional hydraulic model, which we'll talk about next time, to model the floodplain. So it's a pretty tiny drainage, but enough water comes out and it really just spreads out across that whole neighborhood. There's not like one channel that it picks because of the topography. It goes in the roads, like it's just a big mess. Water is everywhere. So a consulting firm did this project. Boulder wanted to have a map done, a floodplain map done. And they presented it, and Boulder, I'm assuming it was the city, kind of like said, this is ridiculous. Like they're used to seeing floodplain maps that are just of a river, and you got the floodplain, and it's basically one straight line down the river corridor. In this case, they showed this mess of water, and they're like, get this out of here. This isn't real. I'm paraphrasing here. That's essentially what was said. All right, so 2013 happens, and this is the mapped extent of flooding from the 2013 flood. So Boulder got a ton of rain, right, in 2013, and this is what happened. So I don't have that, that doesn't line up perfectly, but basically it played out, and people kind of came to Jesus and realized that this kind of flooding is a thing. So we also have, so alluvial fan flooding, like alluvial fans, the big ones might be out there in kind of the wilderness or San Luis Valley, but they're really just kind of everywhere in Colorado. Anytime you have a valley coming up against a floodplain or a river corridor or whatever, a steep area and a not steep area, there's going to be alluvial fans in Colorado just because of our erodible environment. They present unique challenges. Another kind of flood is called pluvial, and pluvial refers to rain. This happened in Houston during Hurricane Harvey. And these folks, I don't know if this was measured. I think this might have been measured. It was possibly modeled. This probably is a model result, where you dump a ton of rain on a very flat area and you get flooding, right? The water table is really high. The water just is stacking on top of water, and all of a sudden everything's just flooded. It's not a river coming out of its banks necessarily, although that did happen. It's just so much rain. And they got 30 to 60 inches of rain. This is, how many inches do you need in a meter here? Almost a meter. Not quite a meter of rain, right? So that's insane. Actually, no, wait. 2 meters, almost 2 meters of rain. Yeah. That's bonkers. And so that happens to pluvial flooding. It just rained so much that the waters rose. So now I'll talk about fluvial geomorphic hazards. So we've talked about these are kind of water-related hazards. Now this is water plus sediment, right? Sediment moves, rivers move sediment constantly. And then when they are kind of energized by a flood, they move around quite a bit. So what we're seeing here, this is the North Fork of the St. Vrain on the other side of Lyons. And we had a very similar thing where the river, it was over here, and then it was over here. And it took this house out on its way. So this was kind of a longer path that had been in for decades, or generation maybe. And then this was a shorter path that it found across the valley. This is the Big Thompson River, and it widened here. So it's a pretty confined valley. It's like a V-shaped valley. This is the highway up to Estes Park. And the river took out maybe a couple hundred feet on either side, went into these homes. They thought they were high and dry. They were out of the floodplain, right? 50 feet up, 30 feet up. No floodplain map would show them getting wet during a flood, but they were still impacted by the flood because of erosion and what I'm calling fluvial geomorphic hazards. Just another picture. This is upstream. You got Drake right here, the North Fork of the Big Thompson. This whole area is on fire right now. They've had it rough. Yeah.
Cameron Beach Fire?
Yeah.
It's grown that much.
It's almost into Estes Park. And then you got another one on the other side.
Over 200,000 acres. So that's just crazy. It went from started top of Rich Canyon, all the way up to Red Feather, clear up on top, came all the way back, and now it's past Estes.
It's just like taking a big old tour of northern Colorado.
Got like 2 feet of snow, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
At one point, hopefully again on Monday. Are your folks evacuated?
They would be if they still live in my old place, but not in their new house.
It's bonkers, man.
Yeah.
Grand Valley's evacuated. It went from nothing to 125,000 acre fire in like 24 hours. East Troublesome Fire. East Troublesome Fire. It's bonkers. So what you can see here is you got a really steep canyon section, and so we had the river incised and widened, and then just downstream it flattened out a little bit and opened up, and then all of a sudden you got all these deposition and braiding kind of response. So these hazards are real, and they don't just play out. They might play out once in a lifetime. In this case, they played out more than once in a lifetime because the 1976 flood hit this same area. How long ago was that? This 2013. Now they got fire. I know, it's rough, man. Living in the mountains is a hazardous endeavor these days. This is a map showing the same kind of thing happening. This is where that house was in that picture, where the river took a shorter path. It used to be up here. The blue is what filled in with sediment, and the red is what excavated or was eroded from sediment. And so you kind of see how this plays out. You've got some erosion, and then you get down here where everything widens and the slope reduces and all this sediment comes out and the river really explodes and does a lot of crazy things. So this happens all over Colorado. It's nothing new. Monument Creek near Colorado Springs, 1935. Estes Park, 2013. Same stuff's happening. Unfortunately, we're not learning lessons here.
So when you're like building a house, do they not tell you that like your house is in danger?
So it depends on where you live. And what I'll say about that is you typically have to go through, and actually we'll talk about that in this next section, about floodplain management in the US. When you build a house, or you have to go through a permitting process. If you're in a floodplain, there's a special floodplain permit. That's going to vary county by county, city by city. So there's some counties that really don't have any process at all. And you can build in the floodplain and right next to a river, and 10 years from now, the flood happens and your home washes into the river, right? So that can still happen. If you're going to get a mortgage, they'll want to know if you're in the 100-year floodplain right now. And that's this FEMA program that we'll talk about. If you are, then you have to get flood insurance in order for a bank to give you a loan. So that's typically how it plays out. But there's a lot of cases where people own their homes, they've been in it for years, and they don't have to have flood insurance, right? Because they don't owe a bank any money.
Kind of building off of that, what about the, if you're a fan?
Alluvial fan?
Alluvial fan, yeah, what if you're.
Alluvial.
Wait, what is it?
There's a lot of words I'm throwing at you. So alluvial fan.
Alluvial.
Uh-huh.
Alluvial fan. So
Yes.
if you're in an alluvial fan, is there any, does that affect you at all or anything like that? When it comes to the permitting process?
Yeah, it depends if the county has designated that as a special hazard zone.
Gotcha. Like, you know, if you're building Boulder. if that's-
Yeah, Boulder is probably on it a little bit more. The 100-year floodplain only exists, remember we talked about this, it only exists if it's been mapped.
Right.
From a regulatory standpoint. So if there's no map, then, and typically for fans, there's not going to be a map because it's not like a special thing. So it's either, is the county aware that this is a hazard and they make you go through some extra hoops to deal with it, or you just kind of go through the process and build. So this happens all over the place. Chaffee County, got a buddy that lives there who's works on this stuff. And he's looking at these developments that are going in, these little washes. And you got one little creek kind of coming through. If that thing catches on fire, that creek isn't going to stay where it is, right? And they're building homes on either side and bridges and all this stuff. And it's in a zone that is going to blow up if a flood event happens. So yeah, this kind of stuff does play out still quite a bit. And the developer doesn't have a whole lot of incentive other than their knowledge of flood hazards or their moral consciousness of doing what's quote unquote right or avoiding these hazards or not, right? So there's a lot of things that make it really complicated, and developments still happen in hazardous areas.
So I mean, like you're in an alluvial fan and you don't technically have to get flood insurance, but your house floods,
You're screwed.
you're screwed.
Yeah.
Wow.
So a lot of it is education, and you got these rural counties, they don't know all this stuff, right? And the state has we'll get into it. The state has a program where they're trying to go out and help folks get maps made and have flood awareness, fire awareness, right? That's the other big one. And a lot of it comes down to property rights. You can't tell someone, there's only so much you can do to like quote unquote force people to build or not build. And maybe it's not build or not build, but where you build within a plot of land. Yeah, so it's complicated, and often people are working with really incomplete knowledge of the hazard.
we're in an advantage, so if we're in a fan, we better just tell ourselves to flood insurance.
Yeah, yeah, I would. You could talk to an engineer or someone. You can call the county about it, right? And they might put you in touch with someone about how to evaluate how risky it is. Are you thinking of a particular thing or just in general?
No, just in general.
Okay.
I'll just give you a call about how.
Yeah, please do. Please give me a call.
Study the area for me.
There's a lot of homes in the Redlands that are in pretty hazardous situations. I'm just going to say that. There's a lot of, just crazy fans and rivers coming, or creek washes coming out of them.
Is your house good?
We're good. I will never buy, mark my words, I will never buy a home in a floodplain. It's just from like it's my profession, so I gotta like heed my own advice, right?
You have to do a HEC-RAS model of the area around your house before you buy.
Yeah, you guys are gonna do one.
Overlapped it on Zillow and you only look at the dots.
Pretty much. So you can actually that website I showed you guys, I'll post it on Canvas, but you can use that. That'll work for fans too. Someone mapped floodplains for the whole US. And it's like it's a hydraulic model that we'll talk about, It's only so good, but it's something. I'm glad you guys have so many great questions. This is like what I do. This is like my favorite presentation. So, all right, FEMA is what manages the floodplain program for our country. And the way floodplain management works in the US is you've got these kind of federal laws and regulations and funding, but there's not a ton of, I should say, laws. There's not a ton of laws behind it. There's not a lot of teeth behind it. It's mostly an incentive-based program. And so each state manages the floodplain management program, and they get money from the feds to create maps, do education outreach, and try to get folks to manage floodplains better. But ultimately, the decision-making of what development it goes where, what home is in the floodplain or not, and what people do to mitigate from floods happens at the local level, cities and counties. And this is where we run into a lot of challenges. The federal government is not going to tell each municipality, each county, how they need to manage their land, what laws they need to use to manage their land. That just isn't how it works in the US. But you end up with a lot of patchwork of regulations in each state and across the country because land use is managed locally. Here's a little calculator you can do at FloodSmart to say if I get 12 inches of water in my home, 2 feet of water, et cetera, how big my home is, what's the damage cost going to be of a flood event? So FEMA's got these kind of calculators. Do I have to take all the drywall out? Do I just have to redo the flooring? Do I lose all my furniture? That sort of thing. You should talk to Carrie sometime because she did, after Hurricane Katrina, went to New Orleans for several months to help gut homes so that they could mitigate all the mold that grew there and then rebuild. Pretty wild experience. Okay, so what the FEMA floodplain program is a lot of things. One is identifying flood hazards, so doing those maps. The other is having a lot of documents and information ready, presenting maps, communicating that. This is actually at the state level, so this is the Colorado's program. They have a community rating system, and this is a way that things that communities can do, like best practices to reduce their exposure to hazard, to better educate the populace about flood hazards. And if you've got a good score for community rating system, your flood insurance rates go down for the whole community. So that's kind of a nice thing. In Colorado, we have fluvial hazard zone mapping. So that's what I talked about earlier. I'll talk a little bit more about that. This is something that I helped develop. We have debris flow mapping, which the Colorado Geologic Survey does. And this is your alluvial fan kind of situation. So these maps are coming out for counties. Floodplain mapping, and then we're converting these old paper maps to digital. Yeah, let's just kind of repeat. Flood insurance rate maps, these are also known as FIRMs, F-I-R-M. This is the kind of regulatory thing. And in Mesa County, you can look at this floodplain map. It's from the 90s. It's pretty old. It's got all these different symbols, all this information. The striped thing is the floodway, and then the blue is the floodplain. And then the orange is the 500-year 0.2% AAP flood. So they show you the 1% and then the 0.2%, 100-year and 500-year floodplain. Right now we regulate to the 100-year floodplain. This is just kind of extra information. This might become more of a thing we regulate to because of the uncertainty that we have in our climate and our modeling. The community rating system is a kind of a cool thing, and communities at the local level, so Grand Junction or Mesa County, could take on some measures. So we could do something like reduce flood damage by thinking about identifying buildings that are in the floodplain and helping them mitigate to flood events. We could have a program that says if we have buildings that are always getting flooded, can we offer to buy them out? Give them fair market value, move them out of the floodplain, because we just keep going back and paying out. There is a lot of different things, and for the homework, I'll have you guys look at a couple of these and talk about them. Public education and warning systems, emergency response systems are part of that. So there's a lot that goes into this, and the more that communities do, the lower their insurance rates are. So these are kind of like best practices in the incentive system. The city of Fort Collins is like a top 10 in the country for their community rating system score. I think they're like number 2. I can't remember exactly, but they're pretty awesome in the work that they do. Not to say that others aren't, but they're very progressive in their floodplain management. There you go. Fort Collins, number 1, 2, 3, 4, number 5 in the country.
Is that just CSU's right there in CSU's?
No, it's the city. They've had a lot of flood damages in the past, and they've done a ton to improve their drainage infrastructure, to buy people out in the floodplain and make the floodplain more of an open space. That the Poudre River isn't causing lots of damage. It's not just the Poudre River; it's all the other little, like Spring Creek and stuff like that. So this has actually come out of a lot of really big losses and flood damages that have happened. And being Fort Collins, they're a little more progressive.
They call out students in that town. It's such a student town. Is that what they're getting at there? Informed on what?
Yeah, I don't know why they put that in there. It just means that they have a big education program. So if you go in Fort Collins, Boulder has this too, and you bike along the creeks, you can see this is where the Spring Creek flood was, the elevation. Here's the elevation of the 500-year floodplain, the 100-year floodplain. Just public information stuff. The average discount on the annual premium is $700. It's pretty good. Debris flows are a thing. This is kind of related to alluvial fans. Does anyone recognize this random spot in Colorado? Give you a hint. It's south of here on the western slope. Close. This is kind of close. This is the San Miguel River, and I think this is Placerville on the way to Telluride. And this is the kind of red sandstone cliff area. And unfortunately, you can see that these are kind of debris flow drainages or alluvial fan drainages. And this is basically an alluvial fan or debris fan that the town is built on. And so they'll get these mud and debris flows that come through every so often. Here's another debris flow. This is near Estes Park. That happened in 2013. So what happens is it rains on these steep hill slopes. Everything kind of liquefies, and you got mud and boulders and trees, and it basically, you got that massive density. It's not just water now, it's water and sediment and rocks, and they can just scrape a whole hillside down and make a really massive scar and kind of dump all this in the river. So you don't want to be in the way of this when that happens. The Geologic Survey has a way to map this. They've taken topography and they run a numerical model to show where debris flows could happen and where they could go. So just outside of Boulder, there's a lot of places where debris flows could happen, and this is real. So it's a big hazard that plays out across the state. Fluvial hazard zone mapping is a new thing. It's something I've been working on for the last 5 years. And this is now kind of published and being implemented in the state. And the idea of fluvial hazard zone mapping is we talked about fluvial hazard. We looked at how the rivers move in response to floods. And so what this map does is attempt to identify an area. This green would be the floodplain, kind of fluvial hazard zone. And then you get a buffer off of that. And the idea of this buffer is the river could erode into this. And even though you're high and dry up here, you're outside of the mapped floodplain, the river could still erode into this margin and take your home out or your property out. And so we want to account for that non-inundation river hazard. It takes into account that rivers avulse, meaning they take a new path. And avulsion is where this is the river before a flood, and then after a flood, it takes a new path. And that's what happened in that St. Vrain Lyons area. So here's the pre-flood channel, here's the post-flood channel. And so you can identify these, and these are features in the landscape that you think the river might take, the path it might take, so you can identify that ahead of time and plan for that. There's a big need for mapping and managing fluvial geomorphic hazards. Nearly 25% of flood insurance claims come from areas outside of this 100-year floodplain. In Colorado, that number was 50% for the 2013 flood, and about 60% since 1978. There's a lot of reasons for that. One is because we have floods that are bigger than the 100-year flood, right? Not all floods are going to be. This is just an arbitrary threshold we decided to manage to. So you get floods that are bigger than that. But and this might just not be, might not be doing a good job of mapping that. But we also have these fluvial geomorphic hazards, which are not accounting for, which these maps don't account for. These are static maps, the ones that we regulate to, assuming the river doesn't move during a flood event, which is often erroneous. So a fluvial hazard map is going to account for the sediment movement and erosion, deposition and erosion. This is about many feet of sediment that deposited out in Estes Park and caused some hazards there. This is inundation erosion, where the water just rises up and gets things wet in the floodplain. Here's a look at what a fluvial hazard zone map looks like. You've got this called active river corridor. You've got the fluvial hazard buffer. Maybe a highway comes through. This is actually modeled off of the Eagle River. A highway comes through and cuts it off. And so this is disconnected, but if maintenance stops on this piece of infrastructure, then maybe the river could incorporate that again. So we want to map that. We look at fans. We don't map where the fans are, but we say that a fan exists and this is a hazard. And if we have a really steep hill slope, you could imagine if the river eroded into here, you could have some sort of landslide or mass failure event. And so we designate that as a geotechnical flag. So you could have a geotechnical failure here.
Just out of curiosity on mapping this hazard zone, you're showing that there's a zone that the flood might only go to here, but it could erode to here. Is that somehow incorporated with like NRCS and the type of soil down through that canyon? Because obviously some can erode more than others and whatnot.
Yeah, right. I will love to share the protocol that we've developed for mapping this that gets into that topic. But certainly you have more and less erodible valley margins. And so where you have something like down in on the Front Range, there's going to be a lot more kind of sandy material. It's less clay, less bedrock, that sort of thing. That stuff's really erodible. And so a flood can do some really big, cut a wide swath, so to speak. In the foothills and the canyons, more sandstone, more bedrock that's kind of metamorphic and granitic rock that's more close to the surface there. And so the river is not going to be able to have as much of a margin to move. And so a big part of this is mapping geology, and you have to have like a geologist on your team to say, this is really erodible. This came from, glacial runoff or something like that, versus this is like bedrock right here, and this is not going to erode very much. So it's not soils necessarily, it's more like superficial geology and how erodible is that corridor that this river exists within.
And for mapping that, I'm sure there's like some sort of guideline on, say, this surface description, and if the velocity of the flow is this much, is how much it can erode. Is that
It doesn't get that specific. That's too hard to do. I tried to do that, and it's kind of coming up with those relationships. There's just too much noise. So that's really hard to do. You can't, like, modeling sediment movement and stuff like that is challenging in this kind of scenario. So we don't have that specific guidance, but we do have guidance based off of data and how narrow the valley is relative to the river. So if you're really narrow and the river is like kind of confined a lot, then you're more likely for the river to erode into the margin versus if you're really wide and the river's kind of in the middle of the floodplain. So that's what the guidance is based off of. Great questions. Another challenge that we have in Colorado that we're going to see play out over the next several years, we talked about this earlier in our runoff, is flooding after fires. So you get a fire, you get rainfall, and all of a sudden you get debris flows, sediment, way more runoff than you normally would had it not been burnt. Do you guys remember why that happens?
So that is more produces a different charge than regular soil, and it repels the water off.
Yeah, you're changing the chemistry and the kind of electrochemical properties of the soil. So it repels water a lot more. It's kind of like spraying Scotch Guard on the watershed, and all that water will bead off and run off more. And you also have less roots and plants to slow things down as well. And so less infiltration, more runoff, more higher velocities, which pick up the soil and bring it down. So you get mud flows, flash floods. And this happens because a lot of these fires are happening in steep mountain areas, right? So here's a picture of the debris flow that happened. You can see everything burnt. You guys see all these rub marks here? That's from the debris flow. So you had this huge boulder-laden flow come through, and it stripped all these trees of their bark. I've seen this. It's pretty wild. They can just beat these trees to a pulp from all the boulders coming through.
And that's from a flood.
So that's a flood after a fire. So the fire happened, right? You can see all the burnt trees, and then everything. Then they had a rain event, and all this sediment and boulders kind of washed down, and you had a debris flow come through here. It's not cool. It's not cool. It is cool. It's pretty wild.
Yeah.
Here's Fountain Creek after the Water Canyon fire. Yeah. Okay. So we have lots of different options for managing the floodplain. We have to manage it because, well, it's a hazardous area. And if we just didn't have any plan in place, then we're going to have a lot of economic losses, personal and community-wide economic losses, right? You lose your home, that's going to be bad for you and your family. If 10 people, hundreds of people lose their home, that's bad for the community. So we want to make sure that the economic viability of cities that are around rivers is maintained. And this kind of governing equation, this risk equation, economic risk equation, is we're thinking about the probability of a flood event and the consequence of that flood. So I want to talk about how we can manage our river corridors so that they're more resilient. This is Lyons again, which got hit really hard by the 2013 flood event. And you can kind of see just the path of the river through the town there. And this river kind of winds through. You've got neighborhoods that are right up against the river, a lot of bridges here. And so, it's kind of a tight area, and a lot of developments happened around that. This is Fort Collins. Here's their river. This is the Poudre River. They've done a lot of work to keep development away from the river, or taken development and removed it. There's some exceptions to that, of course. I think this is the trailer park that was, I can totally remember here. Anyway, there's a trailer park that was converted to like a high-end floodplain development. All the homes were on these pads of soil to keep them out of the 100-year floodplain. Something. So when we talk about resilient river corridors, resilient simply means how quickly does a community bounce back or a river system bounce back from a flood. So we need to think about risk and vulnerability analysis to make plans and think about what do resilient river corridors look like. To respond to this, we can think about structural versus non-structural mitigation. Structural flood control or flood mitigation, there's kind of like the classic examples, which is building levees. So here's a levee in the Mississippi River system that was breached because basically they were kind of relieving pressure on one part of the system to save maybe a city or something downstream. So levees certainly work to a certain extent, but they have a lot of drawbacks. One is they can fail, right? That happened during Katrina in New Orleans. And they're very expensive to maintain, and we have a huge system of levees across the country that we don't invest in and keep up because they're expensive. The other is that levees can encourage development. You put a levee up and now all of a sudden everyone assumes it's safe, but really that risk has been reduced, it's not been eliminated. So levees is kind of one example of a structural control. And also when you build a levee in one place, you're increasing the flood elevation there as well as downstream from a hydraulic standpoint. There's a lot of non-structural approaches we can use. I guess the other structural one I'll talk about is we can build flood control reservoirs. So Cassidy is looking at, I'm not going to remember the name of the park, it's on the Front Range, Chatfield Reservoir. Chatfield Reservoir is a flood control reservoir. And hopefully she'll tell us a little bit more about that in her write-up. But there's a bunch of flood control reservoirs built around Denver that have a normal pool in during low flow that people recreate on. And then during the flood event, every so many decades, that reservoir's got this dam that's just sitting there high and dry, and it'll fill up hundreds of feet to catch that flood event, so it doesn't go through all the development in Denver. In terms of non-structural approaches, we have that floodplain management program that I was talking about earlier, which has incentive programs like the community rating system. It has insurance program, which is kind of an economic resiliency thing, right? You lose your home, you can collect that insurance check and rebuild. We also have something called pre-flood mitigation. We can go and look at our floodplains and say, what's our vulnerability? Do we have elementary schools, hospitals, critical infrastructure that could be harmed by a flood? So when that flood comes, then we're really SOL because the school is closed or the fire department's flooded or town hall or something like that. And we can think about, if we do have that critical infrastructure, what can we do to make it more flood proof? Or can we go actively remove and replace things that are in the floodplain, which could be like a floodplain home buyout program. So this is starting to catch on more in this country. And it's happening here. This is a picture in Louisiana where recently the U.S. flood strategy has shifted to relocation of neighborhoods. These are in coastal areas, these are in floodplains. And instead of using tax dollars, the flood insurance program, it's managed by private companies, but it's backed by the federal government. It's backed by taxpayer money. And so we're using those taxpayer dollars wisely. In this case, there's been some decisions that have been a big change recently, and it's identifying that, well, instead of giving people insurance to rebuild in hazardous areas, should we just buy them out and assist them in moving out of these areas? So that's a big shift. Here's another non-structural opponent. This is where a levee was removed on the Cooter to restore this floodplain. So you get an ecological benefit, it's a recreational benefit. And you also are reducing the pressure of this water essentially and reducing flood stages downstream.
All right, the river crosses shield right there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is my favorite. This is 2014. I took this picture. It's beautiful. Floodplain restoration. So we have a spectrum of responses when it comes to engineering design. We can build it stout and never doubt, right? We can build a huge fat bridge. We can put a ton of riprap in. Or we can think about flexible structures and non-structural mitigation. So here's one kind of end of the spectrum. make sure we're designing the culverts so that they're big enough, or maybe we over-designed to the standard. And we put a lot of, revetment up so that we don't lose this road. That might be important in some cases. But there's other cases where we can think about using green natural infrastructure kind of approaches, where we've got floodplains as more passive uses, like parks and open spaces. We're restoring floodplains, restoring habitat, and reconnecting people with the riverscape. So there's a range of approaches. This is actually a bioengineered bank. You've got boulders at the toe. This is where erosion is most likely to happen. It's at the toe of the bank where the velocity and shear stress is the highest. And then they've done some sort of willow planting with maybe there's some engineered fabric or something underneath. So this is still going to be a bank protection measure, but it's incorporating natural elements.
Is that more expensive?
Riprap is really expensive. I'm not going to tell you that. So this kind of stuff might be comparable in cost. It might end up being cheaper. It just depends. A truckload of rock, though, that can get pricey. We can think about the infrastructure that we have in river corridors and how it impacts the river and vice versa. So here's just a cartoon that I made for this paper that looks at different kinds of infrastructure that we have in river environments. We have diversion structures, we've got levees, riprap banks, roadways, bridges. And here's an example of how we can have those same things and have them be more compatible with the dynamism and habitat hazards of rivers. So a bridge could have its abutments moved back. If we need to go and replace a bridge, you can put culverts in the abutments so that you have high flows can go through. This gives the river more space and reduces the hazard of erosion for your bridge. Diversions can have rock ramps on them. We've got some examples of that in the canyon that allows for fish passage. So you still get your diversion, but now it's not blocking fish passage. And we can move levees back. You can still have levees if you set them back and not just right up against the river, but back, you kind of allow the river to move a little bit more. You can still do farming and kind of less intense practices and protect infrastructure that's offset from the river. Those are just some examples of how we can have more compatible infrastructure, riverine infrastructure.
So it's a suspended pipeline, does that go underground?
Yeah, so the pipeline, and there might be cases where it makes sense to suspend a pipeline, but in this case, pipelines could be eroded. Buried pipelines can also be eroded by the river, so you have to make sure you bury them deep out. This is what happened on the Yellowstone River when you had the oil spill. It happened twice on the Yellowstone River, twice. And they had it 3 feet below the river, and the river had a big flood event and exposed it, and a couple of logs got caught up on the pipeline, and thousands or hundreds of thousands of gallons of oil went into the Yellowstone River.
We're north of Douglas Pass. There's like suspended pipeline everywhere.
Yeah,
Like,
is that oil and gas stuff?
I think it is, but I'm not-
And this is a little simplistic. Suspended pipelines aren't necessarily a bad idea. And in some cases, they make sense because you can't just like dig all the way down and it's like a wash that could be eroding a lot. So in some cases, I think they make sense. Yeah. Here's some real world examples of this. This is the area that's probably on fire right now, the North Fork of the Big Thompson. They had a highway that tracked the outside bends of the creek at the North Fork of the Big Thompson. After the flood event, this highway was taken out. You can kind of see what that looks like. And bridges are expensive, right? So they had to add 2 bridges here. But now we have the outside of the bends are no longer a roadway. It's just the river. So in the future flood that will likely happen here, hopefully not too soon, if this bridge holds, the erosive forces on the outside of the bend will be directed on the mountain and not on the road like it was before. And here's that picture that I use a lot of the levee removal, which is another way we can manage old infrastructure that's no longer serving a purpose.
Is that the spot that they cut that road straight through the hillside? Have you been up there?
Yeah, so that's on the main stem of the Big Thompson.
Oh, this is it.
That was another example though, because the highway was on the outside of the bend
Yeah.
and they cut through basically, a big hill was coming down and a meander bend in the canyon, they cut right through it.
Yeah, it looks just like that.
Yeah.
And then they cut it right through. I remember they worked on it forever, 'cause that cut is huge.
It's wild, yeah. And they, so that's another example of what they're doing is getting the road out of harm's way.
I was up there like briefly after the flood on that road. There were just like giant house-sized boulders just deposited in the middle of the river.
It's wild. Yeah, water and sediment are very strong. This is what they're doing in the Netherlands. Netherlands is obviously it's coastal community. A lot of it's below sea level or near sea level, and they're looking at taking out. They call it the Room for the River project. And what they're doing is they had a lot of dikes and levees. So this is the current situation. They're moving that back, and they're allowing the river to have more room for flooding. And then they're moving the levees back. So this is the levee setback program. You can see where they're setting the levee back. It used to be here. And then they're creating this as kind of a more open space and park-like things. There's a lot of farming that's being impacted by this, and they're working with the farmers to identify areas they can do this, raise their homes, and allow them to farm most of the time, and then every 10 years or something they get flooded. This is a drawing from that Shields Pond project in Fort Collins. The levee outline right here, and now it's a pathway, and we have a lot more access for floodwaters to go into the wetlands behind it. And there it is, Carrie, Penny, and walking along the former levee footprint right there. Just a little more perspective. These are the levees that were removed. This is Shields. Is this Shields? No, this isn't Shields. Yeah, this is Shields. So they took these levees out, and that flood happens in 2013. You can actually see some sediment started moving in this pond. They're filling it in. So the floodwater started doing the work of converting this pond into more of a wetland, which is what the city wanted to happen. That same thing happened down here. All right. That was my floodplain presentation. There's a reading, companion reading for this. It's chapter 12 of your textbook. It goes into a little more detail on the floodplain management program in the US, these structural versus non-structural options. We'll have a homework on this, but I'm going to wait to talk about that until after the exam.